Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. In the first hour, we're going to be talking with Ed Klein. He's been on the program with us many times before. In the past, we've talked about some of his national bestsellers. For example, Guilty as Sin, Uncovering New Evidence of Corruption, and how Hillary Clinton and the Democrats derailed the FBI investigation. We've talked with him about Unlikable, the problem with Hillary, and Blood Feud, the Clintons and the Obamas, and the amateur, Barack Obama and the White House. This new book out, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump. He has always been so good at being able to give us an inside look on what happens behind the scenes and when the cameras are not on. He is a former foreign editor for Newsweek, a former editor-in-chief for the New York Times, and also a contributing editor of Vanity Fair. This new book out, you can find in your local bookstore. We also have a link to it on the website. It is published by Regnery, and either by ordering it online or getting it in the bookstore, you will find out a lot, not only about the Trump campaign, but surprisingly, all sorts of things as well. New insight into everybody from Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton to James Comey. And so, Ed Klein, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, it's great to be with you, and thank you so much for having me.
You know, that's one of the things I thought I would add right off the bat, because I expected to learn a lot about the Trump campaign, and I did, because you traveled with it and you've talked to a lot of people. But I learned all sorts of inside things about Bill and Hillary Clinton. Nothing real new since I've read your other books, and also quite a bit about James Comey. So this book covers a lot more than just the Trump campaign and those individuals in the deep state trying to overturn him, doesn't it?
This book covers a lot of ground, and I've been told that it's a very easy book to read. They're short chapters. It's all about the plot to destroy Trump, including the characters, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Valerie Jarrett, you name them, and some Republicans as well, McCain. We have Senator Flake, Corker. There's just a whole cast of characters, and it reads like a novel, but it's all based on long and detailed reporting on my part.
Well, and again, you have always been able to talk to individuals, get some of the inside perspective. I might also mention that this is the first time I've had a chance to kind of read the summary of what here you call in the appendix the British dossier, which now I think a lot of people call it the Russian dossier, and some of the other field studies. So this is just full of not only great read, but just some great historical material, some of which you've heard about but never had a chance to read. But, you know, when we talk about this campaign of Donald Trump, just a little bit of history. You know, the first presidential campaign that was really contentious was between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. But when Jefferson lost, he didn't try to overturn the administration that much. Some people also compared Donald Trump maybe to Andrew Jackson. You talk about both of those in the book. We have something really that's unprecedented, even though we've had some pretty contentious campaigns in the past, haven't we?
Well, it's so true, Kirby, but, you know, in America, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to overthrow the democratically elected president of the United States and inflict irreparable damage on our country. And that's exactly what Donald Trump's enemies on the left and right are trying to do.
One of the things you talk about in the book is you traveled in the campaign I'd
Yes,
love to
I
have
did.
you. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that for just a minute, because this helps us understand why there's such opposition. There were people that simply could not imagine, and anybody's ever seen some of the YouTube videos put together, just could not, in the wildest imagination, think that this individual would be president of the United States. But as you traveled with him and saw the responses, you saw very early on that indeed he could be the next president of the United States.
Well, let me tell you the story. I've known Donald Trump for some 35 or 40 years. I called him when he announced he was going to be president, and I said to him, at that time you could still call him Donald, not Mr. President. I said, Donald, I'd like to travel with you on the campaign trail. And he said, well, we'll see. That took almost 10 months.
Yes.
He finally said, okay, you're going to be the first journalist ever to travel with me on the campaign trail. Bob Woodward has asked, from Watergate fame and others, and I've said no to them all, but I'm saying yes to you. So I got on a plane and we went to Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd been reading about, in the mainstream media, all about how Donald Trump's base were men, poor, out of work, blue-collar guys who were described almost like the Okies in The Grapes of Wrath. I mean, you
Yes.
just expect a really downtrodden group. I get to Indianapolis, actually, and he's got several events that day, and we go to the first event. It is sold out. I go outside to near the stage to look at the crowd, half men, half women to begin with. There were as many women there were men, so it wasn't all men. Number two, they were all very nicely dressed. I don't mean they were dressed, to go to a ball or anything like that, but they were cleanly dressed, well-groomed, happy people. They brought along their kids for the fun of it. They were enthusiastic. And then when he gave his speech, which was mostly extemporaneous, they reacted to his jokes. It reminded me of the day when I was a copy boy at the New York Daily News, and I covered Billy Graham's crusade in New York. And after he made his, all his prayers, he asked people to come up to be born again, and that was a kind of a religious, what do you call it?
Kind of an altar call.
Yeah, an altar call, and this was secular. This wasn't religious, of course, with Donald Trump, but there was the same kind of look in people's eyes, as though he was going to redeem the promise of America, the dream of America. And it really opened my eyes, and at that point I decided this guy is going to be the next president of the United States.
You talk about that in Chapter 6, a little bit about covering the Billy Graham crusade, and we need to take a break. So when we come back, I would love to talk a little bit more about what's in that chapter, 300 Blows, because you know as well as I do that, first of all, you have all sorts of documentation of what people said about him, but also the other part of that was, well, that will do him in, that will do him in. But again, one of the things you talk about is he can take a punch. Now, he does have a thin skin. You talk about that, too, but he can take a punch, and we'll talk about that. And then I do want to get into some of the issues associated with Hillary Clinton and how this whole idea of having, if you will, an opposition to Donald Trump was really hatched, if you will, in the Obama White House, and how that was played out. Then, of course, we've seen Hillary Clinton on her book tour, which kind of goes back to some of the conflict between Bill Clinton saying, you haven't looked at these polls, you could lose. It may be too late. And she just brushes all of this off. And the sense of surprise, not only on the part of those covering the press that night, which you also talk about in the book, but also the surprise even in the Clinton campaign. So there's just a lot to cover. And again, we won't even try to cover all of the chapters and all the material, but Ed Klein with us today. The book is entitled All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump. It is published by Regnery. No doubt you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if you would like to order it, we also have information about that on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, now that an abortion bill has made its way to the U.S. Senate, we're seeing a number of pro-choice arguments surfacing on social media. Some are gotcha questions intended to trip up the pro-life movement. John Smirek talks about readers to his commentaries that want to argue that he is not consistently pro-life since he's against abortion but favors the death penalty. He turns the argument around and says that we can apply the same logic to pro-choice. Would we approve of a landlord's choice not to rent to people of a race he doesn't like? Would we approve of a worker's choice to work at less than a legal minimum wage? The list can go on, but he explains that hardly anyone accuses pro-choice people of being inconsistent when they apply choice to abortion, but don't favor choice in every situation. Another pro-choice gotcha question comes from Patrick Tomlinson, who asks pro-lifers, would they save in the event of a fire at a fertility clinic 1,000 embryos or a 5-year-old child? Since they would obviously save the child, he concludes that pro-lifers really don't believe that an embryo and a child are of equal value. Professors Robert George and Christopher Tollison answer this in their book, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life. Their answer is longer than we can explain in less than 2 minutes, but here's the gist of it. Every developmental biology textbook declares that human beings begin at conception. No, an embryo is not a baby, but it is a living member of the species Homo sapiens. Unless deprived of a suitable environment or killed, this embryo will develop into an infant. That is what each of us did who is now an adult. By contrast, none of us were an ovum or a spermatozoan. From the moment of conception, we deserve protection. Now that abortion is in the news, it would be wise for all Christians to review the reasons why we should be pro-life. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Ed Klein with us today as we talk about his new book, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump. If you go to our website, pointofview.net, we have a link to edwardklein.com, or you can just go there directly. You can even sign up to receive some other information from his as well. And, of course, the book is going to show up in the bookstores, but we have places for you to order it as well. Ed, let's, if we can, talk about 300 punches in the face and coming back for another round. That you use as an illustration of the number of times when very harsh things were said about Donald Trump. In many cases, he did it to himself. In other cases, other people said it about him. But however that surfaced, everybody was convinced that if he wasn't on the ropes, he was going to be, and it probably wasn't on the ropes, but down for the 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 count. And yet, every time he came back. You talk about that in the book. Explain a little bit of that.
Well, there are two things to say about that, Kirby. One is when I wrote a cover story about Donald Trump in 1992, as I recall, it was a long time ago, he was being excoriated in the press, criticized roundly for being a bankrupt guy who would never come back. And I discovered by looking into his financials and talking to his bankers and talking to people who finance him, going to his casinos, etc., that indeed he was on his way back and was going to be a billionaire once again. And I wrote that in that story,
yes,
which, of course, he, being Donald Trump, loved. So the same, in many ways, the same thing is happening now. He, as you recall, there was that Access Hollywood tape.
Yes.
In which he said some pretty salacious things about women. Everybody said he's finished, he's over with, he's gone, he's never going to possibly become president. He talked about the Gold Star family and the Democratic Convention, and he was criticized for that, criticized for his comments about Megyn Kelly, about Senator McCain. I can go on, and your listeners know all of this.
Oh, sure. And
every time he was counted out, and every time he's come back. And I would never count this man out. I mean, Charlottesville. Let's take Charlottesville for an example. This summer there was a protest that turned deadly, as you recall, in Charlottesville between white supremacists and left-wing anarchists. And Donald Trump said, I'm paraphrasing him, that each side was equally guilty. He was, so much criticism came down on his head for saying that, because he was equating, they said, white supremacists with left-wing protesters, as though the left-wing protesters were, mommy's boys that butter wouldn't melt in their mouth. Well, it turns out, if you read my book, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump, I print an FBI report, verbatim, a whole report, about how these very anarchist, left-wing, violent groups are in cahoots with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, meeting with them in Europe, getting training in bomb making, in the toxic chemicals, that they are perhaps the most, according to the FBI, the greatest, and I'm quoting now, the greatest threat to law enforcement since the 1970s weather underground.
Yes.
Donald Trump was right about that.
Yeah, and again, that's Appendix B and C on the resistance, the radical resistance. And you got, again, an FBI field report. And again, these are things that not everybody has had a chance to see. So that is worth the price of the book alone, not to mention all the stories and anecdotes. But I did want to also, for just a minute, and we will spend some time, no doubt, talking about Hillary Clinton. But I wanted to get to Chapter 8 for just a moment. And that is one of the things I've been trying to do, Ed, is educate our listeners of how to be good discerners of news. And you title the chapter, Abe Rosenthal is Turning in His Grave, because you would expect the New York Times, the paper of record, the gray lady, the one that most people would turn to find out if something is true. You document not only that paper, because everybody gets a good chance to show their incredible bias against Donald Trump, but it's important that those newspapers and other news sources we used to rely on aren't so reliable anymore, are they?
Well, unfortunately, no. I worked at the New York Times for 12 years as the editor of the New York Times Magazine. So I was one of the senior editors there. I worked under editor by the name of A.M. Rosenthal, by the nickname Abe Rosenthal. Mm-hmm. And Abe had a saying, some of which I can say on the radio, which is that you can consort with the elephants in the circus, but you cannot cover them. Meaning, if you're friends with a source, then you can't cover that source. You have to be objective. And this has gone out the window at the New York Times and has now for, I would say, a couple of decades, as the paper has moved further and further to the left. And I say that if Abe Rosenthal saw today's New York Times, he'd turn in his grave, because, Abe is dead, and he his tombstone says he kept the paper straight.
Yes.
And he did keep the paper straight, meaning down the middle, but that paper is not straight anymore, and it now employs reporters who are clearly in bed with the Democrats, with Hillary Clinton, with the so-called progressives, and are just writing negative and harsh stories about Donald Trump practically every day of the week.
Again, the book talks about the campaign, the transition, the first 100 days, and the siege. Just one more question before we take a break on the campaign, and that maybe is to turn to Hillary Clinton. And the last time we had you on, you pointed out with quite a bit of specificity some of the health issues that were surrounding her. And, of course, you have, again, this story of her daughter telling her husband, which would be, of course, Bill Clinton, that she would not go to the hospital because she wants to show that she is healthy. And, of course, you alerted to us almost a year ago, that this was a real issue that was attempted to be covered up. And you found out a little bit more about some of the health issues surrounding Hillary Clinton, haven't you?
That's right. And as you know, she fainted at the 9/11 10th anniversary memorial here in New York City, downtown in New York City, and had to be carried into her car, SUV. She lost a shoe as she was carried. It came off her foot. She was taken to her daughter's apartment downtown. By the way, that apartment was bought by Bill and Hillary's money, $10 million apartment. This is where Chelsea lives. And Bill Clinton was on the phone, wanted Chelsea to send her mother, his wife, to the hospital. And, of course, Hillary was getting advice from her press people. Don't do that because that would really sink your campaign if you went to the hospital. So she put on a pair of special glasses because she couldn't see very well, and walked out alone and said to the press, "I'm okay," and she wasn't okay, and she waved and took off and went home. But the fact of the matter is, after she had her doctor deliver a bill of health, the truth of the matter is, from all the sources I've spoken to, she has, a leaky heart valve. She's on all kinds of medication. She's unsteady on her feet. She faints frequently. This is not a healthy woman, and she's covered that up during the campaign.
One of the things you also document, which I'd never seen until your book, the number of other places where she fainted. And, again, we all saw the 9/11, but we didn't see some of the others, a women's group in Buffalo, boarding a plane in Yemen. We heard about the one in the State Department and others. So this was something that even Bill Clinton, for a second, slipped in an interview and mentioned. But when you come back, we want to move from the campaign to the transition and then the first 100 days and the siege. There's just a lot that we still have to cover in this book, and we'll do our best to kind of give you a brief overview, but I think you're going to find it fascinating, not only because it helps you understand the personalities of Donald Trump, of Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton. A little bit later, we're going to talk about James Comey and people like that, but also, as we've mentioned a minute ago, the value of the book alone for the appendices. If you've always wondered what was in that Russian dossier, now it's actually called the British dossier. You can read it for yourself. There is the FBI field report on the resistance, and then a follow-up material as well on the radical resistance. And that, again, is all available in this book, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Ed Klein. And so let's, if we can, point you to his website, edklein.com. Of course, you can also find information on our website, which will allow you to get a copy of the book if you can't find it in the bookstore, and it's available in hardcover, Kindle. There's even an audiobook that goes with it as well. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about the transition and then the Trump presidency. A lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Ed Klein as we talk about his book, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump. We've talked about the campaign. Let's move to the transition. And in about 40 pages, you help us understand how a lot of this developed even before Donald Trump raised his right hand and took the oath of office. And that starts with denial, as you point out, Ed. But then very quickly, what you talk about in terms of the rise of the resistance. These rallies, these various attempts to do what they could to invalidate the election, These were not spontaneous. Matter of fact, some people now even suggesting that some of that money didn't come from George Soros, but maybe even from Russia. I don't know. But the point is that you very well in those pages document already the attempt to do what they can to destroy Donald Trump even before he took the oath of office.
That's right. On page 91 of this book, I think you're referring to,
sure.
I start explaining how this resistance began and where the money came from. You know, it's very interesting that the television mainstream broadcast networks like NBC, CBS, and ABC play these protests as though they're spontaneous. And they also, this is true if you listen to CNN and MSNBC. Well, what I've discovered, and it's hardly a surprise, and certainly the media should have gotten to this before I did, but they didn't. All of this has been very carefully planned by union organizers, community organizers, left-wing groups in Washington that are well-funded, and they bus these people to these protest sites. So you need a lot of buses. That takes a lot of money and a lot of organization and coordination. Once they get there, they hand them these placards that are supposed to look like they're spontaneously written placards, but they're already done by professionals. They then organize the protests with bullhorns and other people who have, for instance, run union-organized strikes. And then, of course, they have to feed them because they get hungry, and they have to have toilet facilities for them, and in some cases, even ambulances in case somebody gets injured. Then they have to bus them back. That all takes a lot of organizing and a lot of money, and it's not spontaneous at all. It's all part of this refusal on the part of the Democrats and the left to accept the fact that they lost the election.
Yes. Well, again, we talked about that when it was happening because there were even pictures of buses lined up and all sorts of things. And you, again, if you just start thinking about it for a minute, this isn't spontaneous, whether it was the immigration orders we haven't even gotten to when the president has taken office yet, but all sorts of things. But before we move to that, I did want to get to your chapter on fake news because of at least one issue, and that is over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about this so-called Russian dossier, or in your book, we call it the British dossier. But either way, this then allowed for the press, first of all, to begin to talk about the alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and then allowed for the possibility that Trump and Comey, of course, were talking about it, and then, of course, led ultimately to this independent counsel, an investigator. So all of that is what you call fake news. Tell us what you have found out.
Well, you know, there was a law put in place after Watergate that campaigns had to report to the Federal Campaign Commission all their expenses and what they were for, not only what you spent, but what you spent it for. Instead, Hillary Clinton and her campaign manager, I should say chairman, John Podesta, spent millions of dollars and gave it to a law firm called Perkins Coie, which has also represented Barack Obama and Democratic National Committee, to funnel that money to Fusion. And Fusion, in turn, hired this British spy, Christopher Steele, to create this dossier,
right,
which was based on interviews with Russian sources who had Kremlin connections to the Secret Service there in Moscow. So all this information was basically disinformation cooked up by the Russians and then shuttled back to Fusion and then given to Hillary Clinton. And she says, well, it wasn't used during the campaign. Well, that's absolutely not true. This document, 35-page Christopher Steele Russian document, was leaked to many, many media sources. Now, it was unprovable because it was largely untrue, and so they didn't print the actual dossier, but what they did print was these allegations that there were ties between Donald Trump and his campaign and the Russians. So that's where it all began. And as you know, that dossier was used, as you just said, by the FBI Director James Comey as part of his investigation into the Russian interference. He brought it to the attention of the President Obama of the United States and to the President-elect. We believe that he may, that the Justice Department may even have used that document to get a okay from a federal judge to surveil with electronic means members of the Trump campaign. And ultimately, it all led, of course, as you said, to the appointment of the special prosecutor.
Yes. Well, I want to move on to the first 100 days because there's so much in the book and I'm leaving a lot behind. But you talk about the fact that this war on Donald Trump was waged on three fronts: the deep state, Congress, and the streets. We sort of talked a little bit about the streets, although we can come back to that in just a minute. But explain for our listeners that may not understand. We've used the term before. We've tried to explain it. But what does the deep state involve, and how has that begun this investigation of collusion and other things?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of controversy over the question of whether something called the deep state exists. Now, Donald Trump and a lot of his advisors have made a point that there is a deep state, and by that they mean rogue elements in the permanent federal government, bureaucracy, in these various agencies such as the Justice Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Interior Department, the Labor Department, on and on and on. People who were appointed by Bill Clinton, big leftists who live in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, who voted for Hillary Clinton 98, 99%, who were appointed by Barack Obama and then made permanent employees so they couldn't be hardly ever be fired. And these people, according to the FBI, and now this is where we get into another FBI investigation.
Yes.
The FBI infiltrated meetings of these groups in church basements in Washington, D.C., where they were being taught by union organizers, community organizers, and other so-called progressive organizers how to sabotage Donald Trump's agenda by losing files, deleting files from computers, slow-walking orders from their superiors, ignoring orders from their superiors, doing the opposite of what they're told. And this has become such a big problem in many places, but in the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, who is trying to defund sanctuary cities, has discovered that again and again and again his orders have been countermanded by these so-called members of the deep state, these rogue elements in his own Justice Department. And he's trying to root them out. He's having a lot of trouble, and he's complaining about it a lot, as he well should. So this is all very much part of the resistance to Donald Trump.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, continue our conversation with Ed Klein. Since we mentioned the FBI, we'll talk about the Comey affair. And also, if we can, before we run out of time, answer the question that some of you have that is answered in the book. What happened to President Barack Obama? Some expected that he would be in the news every single day challenging the things by Donald Trump. And some days people don't even know where he is or what he's doing. And, of course, we have some really interesting tidbits that come from this book by Ed Klein. So when we come back, we'll get into James Comey, as well as a little bit of President Barack Obama. And, of course, there are so many other chapters we just simply won't have a chance to get into. Some of the campus mayhem, as well as, of course, we've talked a little bit about the investigation of the resistance. So all of it is found in the book, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump. And again, if you'd like to know a little bit more about this book, or you would like to know more about Edward Klein, you can simply go to his website, which we have available on the website as well, edwardklein.com. You can go to pointofview.net, find that. If you'd like to listen to this again, don't forget you can download a podcast or watch it on our YouTube channel, or pass it on to some others that you think maybe need to hear it as well. We'll continue our conversation with Ed Klein right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilt or remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Ed Klein with us today as we talk about his book, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump, the campaign, the transition, the first 100 days, and the siege. And before we go any further, I thought we might just spend a little bit of time talking about James Comey, the individual who was FBI director fired by Donald Trump. But I also learned a lot about his personality, how for, as you said, a big man, he's amazingly quick on his feet. That was one of the interviews you did with somebody. Even though he's 6'8", sometimes he would shout, run around the table and look like he was going to pounce on somebody. And so because of his size and because of his position, could really intimidate individuals. And as I understand it from your book, was really going to clean house until he was fired by Donald Trump. But what do we need to know about James Comey, especially in light of the fact that his name will, I think, continue to surface with some of these investigations about what happened at the FBI?
Well, it's very interesting. James Comey, when you read about him in the mainstream media, you thought he was the last Boy Scout in Washington, D.C. His reputation was very high. And the reason it was high is because he countermanded an order in the George W. Bush administration when he was in the Justice Department and threatened to resign, and he became a hero of the left when he did that. So that's one of the reasons why he was always referred to in the mainstream media in such glowing terms. But in point of fact, James Comey worked under Robert Mueller as Mueller's deputy when Mueller was the director of the FBI. Now, during that time, Mueller became James Comey's son's godfather. That's how close they were.
Yes.
And those two were in charge of investigation during the so-called Uranium One scandal. That is the scandal in which $135 million flowed into the Clinton Foundation at the very same moment that Hillary Clinton was approving the sale of our uranium, 20% of our uranium production, to the Russians. And Bill Clinton was getting a $500,000 fee for a single speech from a Kremlin-connected bank in Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Comey and Mueller were supposed to be investigating that. They never did. They never looked. They never saw the fact that this was corrupt. There were obvious bribes. They had an informant in the FBI who is going to testify finally, hasn't yet, who knew about all this and told them about it, and they did nothing about it. So I believe that both James Comey and Robert Mueller are compromised and clearly should have no part in this special investigation.
I would certainly agree. And, of course, Peter Schweitzer had been on the program a year ago with Clinton Cash talking about this. Of course, the article that appeared by John Sullivan in The Hill. Of course, you also have the Clinton campaign and the DNC paying for the Russian dossier. That appears in the Washington Post. So we're not talking about things that are in just a so-called right-wing press. These are in mainstream documents.
Exactly.
And, again, there are just a lot of documentation in your book. But I thought before we go, I wanted at least to ask a question that a lot of our listeners have wondered about, and that is, what is President Barack Obama up to? And I think as soon as I read the first sentence in Chapter 26, I got it. And that is, a close friend said Barack wants to go back to his youth. And Valerie Jarrett says he wants to recapture the freedom of his youth. Well, anybody that knows anything about that, during his youth, he used to smoke marijuana. I turned the page, and that's what you say he's doing now. So he's actually not wanting to go and challenge everything that Donald Trump is doing. He just wants his freedom back and really wants to go and allow himself to do anything he wants to do at any time that he wants to do it.
Well, you've said it very well. And this is based on a source of mine who actually has smoked dope, if that's what it's called, or weed or marijuana, with the ex-president. The ex-president is also popping cannabis-infused gummy bears. He does this in the backyard of his home in the Calorama section of Washington. He does it on trips that he takes. I'm told that he gets stoned a couple of times a week, and that his wife is very upset about this because it's a very bad example for their kids, their two daughters. It happens that in Washington, D.C., recreational marijuana is legal. So he's not doing anything illegal.
Right.
But it is a really shocking state of affairs when a former president who served for 8 years and was the head of his own party is now stoned some of the time and not taking part in any discussions or hardly any discussions of politics, because he doesn't want to have any part of politics. He's sick and tired of politics. And as you just said, he's kind of gone back to his, I would call it his adolescence, and is, doing what he wants to do when he wants to do it. He walks around in jeans and a leather jacket and Gucci sunglasses, and he's, the hipster ex-president. And that's why he's not leading this opposition to Donald Trump, but has, in effect, given this leadership back to Hillary Clinton, who is clearly, she and her cohorts, trying everything in their power to undermine Donald Trump.
We should have seen this because you talk about in the book when one time he was asked to pick his favorite character from Star Wars, he said, well, Han Solo, because he's a bit of a rebel. Right. And we should have seen it. There were some people, and I even bought into it for a short period of time, that, well, they're buying this house and he's going to be the, if you will, the deep state in the opposition to Donald Trump. And I don't deny that he and some of his associates are. But when he decided to go to Tahiti and go to the Brando, which you talk about, Marlon Brando, that set a signal. And then when he's with David Giffen and all these other things, guess I should have figured that out, and I think other people have as well. But again, you document that in the book. And since we're just about out of time, Ed, I just want to again encourage people, if they'd like to know a little bit more about you, they can go to your website, edwardklein.com. Talk about what they'll find when they land on that website.
Well, on that website, you'll have all the blogs that I've written, including the most recent. Plus, you'll be able to, at edwardklein.com, order my new book at a great discount called All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump.
And again, I think people can find it in the local bookstore, but if they want to go to your website, we have that as a link right under your picture there. And as we also always provide, there is a link there so that you can follow you on Twitter, on Facebook, and, of course, you have information about signing up for your blog. So, Ed, it's always great to have you on the program. I still can't believe how you get people that are so close to these individuals to share their anecdotes with you, but we are the beneficiary of it, and thank you for, once again, writing a book that helps us understand a little bit more of what is happening behind the scenes. Well,
thank you so much, Kirby, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on your program. The conversations are always so intelligent, deep, and interesting, and I appreciate it very much.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to focus on the issue of persecuted Christians, and there's a very good reason for that. First of all, we're going to give you an opportunity to respond, but the next 2 Sundays are designated as the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. So those of you in positions of church leadership, you may be a pastor, Bible fellowship leader, Sunday school teacher, small group leader, I wanted you to know about that. But if you have been listening to Point of View for some time, you perhaps have also heard us talk about the Cradle Fund, and we're going to talk about how you can respond again. Now we're not just trying to rescue those individuals that have left Syria and Iraq. We're hoping that we might be able to even have some of them return. So we're going to talk more about what that means with James Chen. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Engagement. Going to be a fascinating conversation in the second hour. Hope you can join us. If you can't, take the time later to listen to this, because we have already sent out an email describing what we would encourage you to do, and we'll explain more about that right after these important messages.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. In our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View radio talk show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to talk about the persecuted church, and I do want to alert you, as I did last hour, but some of you may be just joining us, that the next two Sundays are designated as the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. Now, we have talked about this before with Johnny Moore, with Tom Doyle, and a variety of other individuals that we've had in studio with us, as well as others by phone. Matter of fact, I'm going to be with former Representative Frank Wolf this weekend in Washington, D.C., so these are individuals that certainly have talked about persecuted Christians. And if you have listened to Point of View for any length of time, you know that a while back we decided that in addition to educating you about this and calling you to pray about this, we also encouraged you to give. And so we identified the Cradle Fund as a great way to actually begin to rescue some of those individuals that had to flee from their homes, from Syria or Iraq or wherever it might be, and we're in these refugee camps. And so we are going to spend some time now talking about some ways in which you can be involved again. I think the last time I heard we had been able to channel this money. We didn't take anything out, just sent it right on to the Cradle Fund. It was up to about $60,000. So again, we're going to spend some time today talking about what can be done and what is happening to Christians around the world and the persecuted church. So we bring to the microphone James Chen. He is the executive director of the Institute for Global Engagement. Prior to being working with IGE, he was a research associate and academic resource coordinator in the U.S. Department of Defense's Near Eastern and South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, an individual that holds both a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, as well as a master's degree in international relations and security from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And he joins us now by phone. James, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kirby. Thank you very much for having me on.
Let's, if we can, talk about the Cradle Fund. This is something our listeners, if they've been listening to the program for some time, may be familiar with, but I recognize we have new stations. We have listeners that have just begun to listen to this program. So talk about the Cradle Fund, because we're going to encourage some of our listeners to consider what they might do to support this opportunity to help those who are being rescued, in some cases restored, and even now even returned. So talk about the Cradle Fund, if you might.
Certainly. Thanks, Kirby. Yes, so the Cradle Fund was set up in 2014, and if the listeners remember, that was the height of the ISIS crisis, if you will, in the Middle East. At that point, the ISIS forces had overrun much of northern Iraq. Many of the Christians, as well as other ethnic and religious minorities, had been either enslaved or killed or forced from their homes and their hometowns. And so Point of View Ministry and your loyal listeners really came through in a big way for us. And as you said, $60,000 was such a wonderful help. We basically channeled that to our Cradle Fund partners on the ground in the region. And to date, we have been able to impact over 125,000 people. And that was following our 3R strategy. And basically, that strategy is consisting of rescue, restore, and return. So most of the money was for the rescue phase, and that was understandable at that time. there was a desperate need for humanitarian supplies, for heating, for tents, for housing units, in order for people just to be able to make it through the winter. And now we see, fast forward to 2017 right now, amazingly, and something I was actually quite surprised to just see in the past few months, coalition forces, with the great help of our U.S. military, have basically expelled ISIS from many of the areas in which the Christians had been living in their hometowns. And so we're basically transitioning now from the rescue phase to the restore and return phase. And basically the need right now is for Christians to be able to return to their hometowns, to rebuild their homes, to get their businesses back up and running. And so that's what the Cradle Fund is all about right now. And we're hoping to be able to basically implement a sustainable strategy. So not just giving handouts, but that they can get their lives back together. And we can work at a policy level to ensure that they can live in an environment in which all faiths can be able to worship and practice their faith freely.
So again, this is an opportunity for all of our listeners. First of all, let me just mention, if you go to our website right now, we have a banner that actually has those three words: rescue, restore, and return. And in the past, it really was sort of a handout, but now this is, if you will, a hand up. And if you click on that, it explains a little bit more about that. And again, we will channel all of the funds that are designated through that account. You can either give through the website and put it on your credit card, or if you write to us and designate that to the Cradle Fund, we will send that as well. We're going to talk about what that means. Also, we have some calls coming in, so let me just mention, I'll open up the phones right now, because I know some of you may have some questions about, well, what can I do to help persecuted Christians, and where would the funds go, and what will it be used for, and all those kinds of questions are certainly germane, and that's why I wanted to have James Chen on for this hour, so that if you had some questions about this, that is the case. I know many of you have demonstrated that you are very generous, but this is an opportunity to do what we talked about in the beginning, and that is, it is one thing to have these people rescued and in these refugee camps, and to channel the funds through various pastors who are working in those camps, and in many cases living there themselves. But it's even more exciting to return Christianity back to its place of origin in some of these countries. This has been the first time that Christians have been expelled from some of these regions, and these are historic regions. You think about the former Nineveh and other places like that, and Baghdad, and even think about the various significance of Babylon and Iraq and all of that. We certainly want to give you that opportunity to participate. So let me take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue looking at this from James Chen's perspective and giving us an understanding of how you can be involved. But if you are taking some notes, and I would encourage you to do so, because you may want to pass this on to your Sunday school class, or you may want to forward this on to your pastor or your Sunday school leader or something like that. The three words we're going to talk about are rescue, restore, and return. In the past, we talked about just trying to rescue these individuals. In some cases, give them pillows, give them blankets, give them sheets, give them basic food and resources. But now to restore them, to provide counseling and resources to restore them, some of those who have suffered at the hands of ISIS or the Islamic State. But most importantly, this idea to return home and rebuild, to return. So rescue, restore, and return. So we'll continue our conversation. And if you'd like to join us, I already have some calls I'll get to shortly. 1-800-351-1212 is the number to call. If you say, well, I would like to participate in this, we have given you this opportunity. We are spending some time right now talking about the Cradle Fund, especially because we are at the 2 Sundays, this Sunday and next Sunday, have both been designated as the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. I would encourage your church to pick one of those Sundays to focus our time and attention so that we pray for our brothers and sisters in Christ. We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, now that an abortion bill has made its way to the U.S. Senate, we're seeing a number of pro-choice arguments surfacing on social media. Some are gotcha questions intended to trip up the pro-life movement. John Smirek talks about readers to his commentaries that want to argue that he is not consistently pro-life since he's against abortion but favors the death penalty. He turns the argument around and says that we can apply the same logic to pro-choice. Would we approve of a landlord's choice not to rent to people of a race he doesn't like? Would we approve of a worker's choice to work at less than a legal minimum wage? The list can go on, but he explains that hardly anyone accuses pro-choice people of being inconsistent when they apply choice to abortion, but don't favor choice in every situation. Another pro-choice gotcha question comes from Patrick Tomlinson, who asks pro-lifers, would they save in the event of a fire at a fertility clinic 1,000 embryos or a 5-year-old child? Since they would obviously save the child, he concludes that pro-lifers really don't believe that an embryo and a child are of equal value. Professors Robert George and Christopher Tollison answer this in their book, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life. Their answer is longer than we can explain in less than 2 minutes, but here's the gist of it. Every developmental biology textbook declares that human beings begin at conception. No, an embryo is not a baby, but it is a living member of the species Homo sapiens. Unless deprived of a suitable environment or killed, this embryo will develop into an infant. That is what each of us did who is now an adult. By contrast, none of us were an ovum or a spermatozoan. From the moment of conception, we deserve protection. Now that abortion is in the news, it would be wise for all Christians to review the reasons why we should be pro-life. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, I'll take some phone calls in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. This Sunday and next Sunday are both designated as the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. Please encourage those positions of leadership, those individuals that hold those positions, to actually focus a little time and attention on this. We do need to be praying for the persecuted church on a regular basis, but especially during these 2 Sundays, it's a real opportunity to remind us of what it's like. The number one country where persecution seems to be the most tense is, of course, North Korea. We've talked about that many times before with our friends with Open Doors. But almost every other country then, from 2 all the way down to a very long list, are Muslim countries. And this is why we wanted to focus your time and attention today on the Cradle Fund, which is a way to begin to help those believers, many of whom had to escape in the night to prevent being captured or killed by the Islamic State, known as ISIS. James, talk a little bit more about if indeed individuals give to this fund, and we've had a good response in the past. I have every reason to believe we might as well this time. What does the money go for? In the past, we talked about in the rescue phase, we're talking about blankets and pillows and food. We're now kind of in the restore and return phase. What will that look like?
Yeah, that's a really crucial phase transition. The restore phase is what we refer to as actions taken to bring trauma counseling and education to those refugees and people that have been the victims of persecution from the Islamic State. This takes mostly the form of, particularly for women that have endured unspeakable horrors from whether defectors from the Islamic State or just in refugee camps or whatnot. It is primarily bringing trauma counselors, bringing people that can train people to train more counselors to minister to women that have suffered that kind of violence. And we've seen that one of the most important needs for refugees and other victims is for trauma counseling, because if that goes unaddressed, that can lead to great mental harm down the road and could even just greatly affect the ability of these people to be able to just function normally in the future. So that's one aspect of Restore. The other aspect is education. As you know, many of these refugees are children, and since fleeing from their hometowns, they have not had any opportunities to be able to receive schooling to continue their education, and some for a period of 2 or 3 or more years right now. And so part of the Restore phase is also in just providing really good educational opportunities for these children, so that there's no break in the continuity of their learning. So that's the Restore phase. And the Return phase, that's one of the most exciting aspects for me and the Cradle Fund right now. We're seeing basically this opportunity for refugees to be able to go back home. And I think, probably for many of them, they maybe never even thought that they'd see this day come so soon, frankly. But just with the amazing advances that the coalition forces, that the U.S. military has been able to bring about in northern Iraq and in Syria, many of these families that live, especially in the Nineveh Plains region of Iraq, are able to go back home. The main issue now, though, is many of these homes have been just damaged, some beyond recognition from the fighting, and sometimes that's just intentional sabotage by ISIS forces that have fled those hometowns in advance of coalition forces. And so, much like how Americans here experienced those major hurricanes, people want to be able to go back home and want to be able to rebuild their homes, but they need resources and some assistance in doing so. And so that's part of the return phase of the 3R strategy. Get their homes rehabilitated, renovated, basically back in a condition in which they and their families can live, and then also to be able to get the local economic activity going again, that people can get their businesses started up again. And so, that's what we're hoping to achieve with the return phase at this point.
So again, some great resources that you can provide to the Cradle Fund. Again, we have also in the past supported Samaritan's Purse. Matter of fact, had them on recently in terms of all the work that they've been doing in the flooded areas in Houston and in Louisiana as well as in Florida. But Cradle Fund was one that was mentioned a while back by Johnny Moore. We have had a good relationship with them. If you say, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about the organization, the Institute for Global Engagement, we have a link to that on the website. We have a picture of James Chen, who's the executive director there. We also have an article there at the Institute for Global Engagement, so you can find out more about what they're doing. But one of the things I really want to challenge you to do is to visit our website, pointofview.net. Click on that banner there that says Rescue, Restore, and Return, I guess I should say. Your gift will help those who are persecuted for their faith. Of course, if you'd like to write to us, so you know the address. It's Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. So whether you send a check or whether you actually decide to click on that banner and put it on your credit card, we will have 100% of the funds go to the Cradle Fund. And if you'd like to join us on air, we'll take calls along the way as we talk about the broader issue there of the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. So let's go to Michigan first. And Keith, thank you for joining us today. I think you have a story about persecuted believers in Nigeria. Go ahead.
I do. I had the privilege of having a roommate back in the 1980s. He was from Nigeria. And ironically, he now works as a Christian. He works for the government of Nigeria, which is ironic because it's a Muslim country. But at the time, he fought during the Civil War in the 1960s. During that time, the Muslims were going into the northern side of Nigeria, which is mostly Christian.
Yes.
A bunch of Muslims came up and they set fire to their crops to try to burn them out. And for some strange reason, there was this big wind that came up and turned the fire and started going back towards the guys who were the Islamists, the Muslims who set the fire, started coming back towards them. So they started running away in a different direction. And he said God was intervening because that fire turned a 90-degree turn and started chasing them again. So it was protection.
And it is amazing. Some of these stories that you hear are incredible. And if you have not read some of the books by Johnny Moore, Tom Doyle, to mention just a few, just incredible stories. But again, James, you've heard those kind of stories as well, that believers find themselves praying for God's protection. And many times they're just asking for us to pray that they would have boldness. But how would you recommend that we pray for these persecuted Christians, since we are now coming to these 2 Sundays in which we have an International Day of Prayer for the persecuted church?
Yeah, great question. I think probably one of the best ways we can pray for them first is to be able to pray for peace in the political environment and the geopolitical environment in Iraq. Some of your listeners might know about the Kurdistan independence referendum, the vote that took place a couple of weeks ago. And as a result of that, most of the Kurds voted for independence, those that voted. And then that led to some conflict between the Peshmerga, the Kurdistan army, and the Iraqi National Army, both of whom are U.S. allies. But because of that independence vote, the Iraqi army started moving in on different areas that were held by the Kurdish army. And so unfortunately, a lot of the Christians and their villages are caught up in the crossfire. Now, it seems like there may be more possibility of some kind of a peace or resolution to this. The U.S. government has been trying to mediate for that. But, as it is in the Middle East, conflict can just easily flare up at any time. And so I think one of the things that holds refugees from, going back to their hometowns is just fear and, a lack of security that,
the uncertainty.
Exactly. Yeah. Will they be fighting again? And so I would say that would be one of the prayers, praying kind of for peace, a sustainable peace in that region.
Very good. Let me take a break, and when we come back, let me take some more phone calls. Is your church planning to actually focus on the persecuted church? What has your church done to actually give and to pray for those individuals, our brothers and sisters in Christ, who are suffering for their faith? And if you've given to the Cradle Fund before and want to give a testimony about that, we'd love to hear from you as well. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221.
Point of View will continue after this. You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you would like to ask a question, we'll keep individual James Chen on for a little bit longer, Executive Director at the Institute for Global Engagement. And if you just happen to be joining us, we're talking about the fact that Christianity is certainly under attack around the world. And for those of you that receive an email, probably received this one, which we sent out early this morning, and we see a growing hostility towards our faith and efforts to silence our voice. And so it is very important for us, first of all, to pray for those persecuted believers, our brothers and sisters in Christ who are suffering for their faith. And this Sunday and next Sunday are designated as the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. So that's the first thing that we would encourage you to do. And so if you can do a favor to me and to our guest, encourage your pastor or other church leaders to maybe have a special emphasis on prayer for the persecuted church this Sunday or next. But second of all, I would love to give you an opportunity to put some legs to your prayer. And that is, as we've done once before, we've partnered with the Cradle Fund once again. It is tied to the Institute for Global Engagement, and we're talking with James Chen, the Executive Director. And this is a gift that you can give to help those individuals. In the past, we were talking about really just sort of rescuing these individuals who find themselves in a refugee camp and have sometimes just the clothes on their back. And so that was emergency assistance. Now we're moving into not just the rescue phase, but the restore phase to really help them deal with some of the emotional struggles, deal with the educational lack that has transpired, but then actually go to the third R, and that is return, to provide resources for them to return home and to rebuild their homes because they have been driven out by the Islamic State. And because of the success, this is just a great opportunity. So let me again encourage you to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212, and talk about, if you could, for just a minute, James, what kind of budgets are you starting to put together for this idea of a rescue and return? So what, again, will some of these funds actually be able to go for?
That's a great question, Kirby. Recently, we've been talking to some of our partners on the ground, and we always take our lead from them and trying to basically see what the real needs are. And so right now, they pointed out two crucial needs. One, obviously, are the rehabilitation, the rebuilding of the homes. And the second are microloans for getting people's businesses back up and running. Now, obviously, you would probably need to get the homes built before doing the businesses. And so we're kind of focusing more on the rehabilitation of homes right now. And, I was really surprised to learn just a couple of weeks ago that, our money can go a really long way in that region.
Yes.
If, for example, if I'm going to be, outfitting my deck or something, that might come up to around $5,000 or so, or, a little bit more. For that money, you can basically rehabilitate an entire house in one of these Nineveh Plains villages where the Christians reside and has been their hometown for ages. So they can have their entire house rebuilt for that amount of money that we would spend on, just renovating our deck or our patio or something. So that's a kind of value that I think that we're looking at right here. And so basically that's what we would be devoting all the funds for is rebuilding these homes, and then getting more and more families to be able to return to the region, because we think that it is just so vitally important for the body of Christ to remain there and for a witness to God to be there.
And again, you mentioned the Nineveh Plains. I thought for just a minute we might give people a geography lesson. These were called the Plains of Mosul. Of course, Mosul and Nineveh, same thing. I mean, there was even the argument, whether this is true or not, that Jonah's body is there. And of course, it was desecrated by the Islamic State. But nevertheless, we're talking about a region that has had a lot of Christian influence. And I'm excited about the possibility that we could return Christian influence back to this region that has had Christians living in it since shortly after the expansion of the gospel in the first century. True?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's just so amazing to think, when we read through the Old Testament, the book of Jonah, talking about Nineveh, that's exactly the location that we're talking about. And, and I have to confess, before, ISIS came along, I hadn't even known about a significant presence of Christians in the Middle East. That's kind of goes to show how ignorant I was. But now, having been able to visit the region, seeing what they've gone through, I really do believe God has just a special, he has a special plan for everyone, but especially for them. And he has a special heart for those that really have suffered for his name. And so I think it's basically just incumbent upon us as, brothers and sisters in other more blessed, more fortunate parts of the world to be able to do what we can to help them out.
Again, these are the Assyrian Christians, and again, they go back to some of the early centuries, and this has been the first time that all Christians have been removed from that area, because even when you have the Muslim army that came out of Mecca and began to take different parts of the world, and certainly the army that went first to the west, to northern Africa, into Spain. We talked about that last week. But you also had the Muslim army moving out to the east into today what we would call Iraq and that area. You still had Christians living in that area called the Nineveh Plain. So one of the things that I wanted our listeners to understand is you're really helping to minister to those individuals who have been dedicated Christians in a Muslim land for a long period of time and have suffered. And so they were driven out of their homes by the Islamic State. Now, because of the military success, they can come back and rebuild it. And I like, James, what you point out. For what we might think is an insignificant amount. I mean, some of our listeners might say, well, I'll click on the button there and it says donate, and you have an opportunity for me to donate $50. Well, what good would that do? Or $100? What good would that do? This is maximized when you go to that region of the world. And as you point out, for a few $1,000s, which you might use in a remodel of your house, you could build an entire house. For a few $1,000s, you can build a number of houses in these villages and repair the ones that are left standing, and really begin to once again establish a Christian community in that region of the world. So I'm really excited about this, and I hope people will consider what they might do to click on that button and give to the Cradle Fund. So again, 100% goes to your organization. Talk about how you distribute it to those individuals in need.
Yeah, exactly. We basically work through partners working directly on the ground, ministering directly with those that have been affected, that have been persecuted. We follow their lead, and we also do a lot of vetting of different partners in the region. And so just over the course of these past 3 years or so, we've been able to work very closely with some organizations that have really proven to be trustworthy. They've proven to be godly, and just, I would trust them with my life, and I have in many circumstances in visiting the region. And so, the money goes directly to them, and they use that to help the refugees and those persecuted. And so, just talking a bit about the history of the region as well. There's a book called The Lost History of Christianity by Philip Jenkins, and it talks about how, the presence of Christians was actually quite widespread, not only throughout the Middle East, but also even Central Asia, and even they had reached up to China at one point. And so, it's, right now we see that region as almost like a spiritual, almost like a desert or a wasteland. But the church was quite vibrant at one point in history. And so, we feel that being able to maintain that presence of these, the church, the body there, is just so important. So yeah, we want to thanks in advance all the listeners that are giving already.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. If you have any questions real quickly, I wanted to give you that opportunity because, again, we will continue this fundraising effort for a period of time and really do encourage you over the next couple of days to consider what you might do to give to the Cradle Fund. Then we're going to move on, but I hope that you will be as generous this time as you were in the past, because we're not just now talking about rescuing these individuals, which has been a handout, but now a hand up to restore and to return them. And it's exciting to think about how that is progressed. So if you'd like to join us on air, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more, you can go to the website, pointofview.net.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilt or remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, we have with us James Chen, Executive Director at the Institute for Global Engagement. And again, we are talking about your financial support to the Cradle Fund. I would encourage you to consider what you might do because, as we have mentioned just a minute ago, Christianity is under attack around the world. We are focusing our time and attention today on the Middle East. But again, I hope you'll understand that the next 2 Sundays are designated as the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, and I would encourage you to pray. In just a few minutes, I'll talk about some of those prayer targets, as well as to encourage those people that you might know that are in positions of leadership. Maybe your pastor might be an elder, a deacon, a Sunday school teacher, whatever, to have a special emphasis on prayer in the next couple of weeks. James, just before I let you go, let's again talk about what is available. When people give to us, we will pass that on to you. But one more time, just again, since people kind of tune in and tune out, talk about the Cradle Fund and how that will be used to begin to aid those believers, fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, so that they will not only be restored, but even possibly return to the Nineveh plain. So talk about where those dollars are going to go.
Yeah, that's right. The Cradle Fund is basically helping those believers, those persecuted people that basically are in the cradle of Christianity. That's where the name comes from, for the Cradle Fund. The cradle of Christianity. And, these believers, they actually speak Aramaic. That was the language that Jesus Christ spoke when he was here on this earth. And so, they are carrying on a very sacred tradition. And so, basically, we're, through the Cradle Fund, we're hoping to be able to provide assistance to them to be able to return to their hometowns. Many of their hometowns had previously been occupied by ISIS forces. Now that the the coalition forces have forced them out and have defeated most of them, these refugees are able to return to their homes. Unfortunately, because of all the fighting and just sabotage by the ISIS forces, lots of their homes have been in severe state of disrepair or just have been destroyed. And so, if you can imagine having to flee from your home and then returning a few years later just to find it completely ransacked or just, a pile of rubble, how discouraging that would be. And so, part of this is basically being able to help them get back on their feet, to have homes to live in, to get their families back together, to have a stable, secure lifestyle. And, and this money would also go towards stimulating the local economy. This would be paying for workers, locals, to be able to help with their rehabilitation and with the renovation and the repair of these homes. And so that's what the Cradle Fund is dedicated to at this stage.
Very good. Well, again, James Chen, I appreciate the work that you do there at the Institute for Global Engagement, and thank you for giving me the better part of an hour today to educate our listeners. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
We are going to, again, encourage you to consider what you might do to help out the 3 R's that we talked about. First of all, rescue. We have talked about that in the past, really providing emergency assistance to some of those who are fleeing persecution. That's something we did through the Cradle Fund a number of years ago. Many of these people, as we pointed out, were forced to leave their homes with little or no notice, and so we wanted to minister to them while they were in the refugee camps. Now we're kind of in more the restore phase. Some of that involves counseling, because some of the very horrific things these individuals have been through is certainly important. Also, education we talked about as well. And those are the restore form. But then we also want to talk about return. We're now actually able to talk about this, to provide the resources for them to return home and to rebuild. So those are some resources that you can provide. If you go to our website, again, we have 100% of what you give directly going to the Cradle Fund, and we have been in the past just so encouraged to see that almost $60,000 was given. We'll see what it happens to be this time. But also, let me, as we end here, talk about the very important issue of this Sunday or next as a day that has been set aside to unite believers and to pray for the persecuted church. Now, this happened back in 1996. The World Evangelical Fellowship actually coordinated various churches and Christian organizations to do this. It's now become a worldwide prayer event. And so this is one reason why I would encourage you to take the time to actually pray. And if you have not done so, pass some of this information on to your pastor, your elders, deacons, church leaders of some sort, Bible fellowship leaders, and others. You know, the scriptures really admonish us to pray for those who are persecuted. You think, for example, of Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3. It says, "Remember those in prison as if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who were mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering." Paul also reminds us in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 26, "When one member suffers, all members suffer. So again, let's talk about those prayer targets for just a minute. And the first would be certainly to recognize that we should pray for courage. It obviously takes courage to stand for Christ in a country that is hostile to your beliefs and actively persecute you. And as I've pointed out, of the number one country that has persecuted Christians the most is North Korea. But most of the other countries on that list by open doors are Muslim countries. So again, we are talking about how difficult it is to stand for Christ in the midst of the occupation and persecution that comes from Muslim leaders. Second, I would encourage you not only to pray for courage for them and boldness, but to pray for faith. Pray that those persecuted believers will grow in grace and increase in faith as they face persecution. Then third, I would also encourage you to pray for hope. You know, it really is hard to find reasons for hope when you live in this world of persecution. So pray that they would be empowered and pray that they would press on in the midst of what I'm sure is very discouraging. And then finally, pray for help. Many of these persecuted Christians need food and medicine and finances. We've given you an opportunity today to really, in a sense, put some legs to your prayers by actually joining with the Cradle Fund, and you can go to our website to find out a little bit more. Pray that these needs would be met by fellow Christians and various Christian organizations. So I am thrilled that Sunday has been set aside as a time to pray for the persecuted church, and if you can't do it this Sunday, then do it next Sunday. We've given you advance notice, and we wanted to also give you an opportunity to give if you would choose to do so. So let me again encourage you to go to the website. You can find out a little bit more about this idea of rescue, restore, and return. You can find out a little bit more about the Cradle Fund. Of course, we also have a link to the Institute for Global Engagement and James Chen, so you can check them out as well. We've checked them out in the past. Johnny Moore is the one that first pointed us in that direction, and we've enjoyed the relationship we've had with them. And, of course, the relationship we've had over the years with Samaritan's Purse. Wherever you want to give is great, but we wanted to focus our time and attention on that today because of the possibility that we can return Assyrian Christians who speak the same language that Jesus spoke back to the Nineveh plain. So all of that is available on our website, pointofview.net. First hour, we spent some time talking with Ed Klein about his book, All Out War, The Plot to Destroy Trump. Second hour, we spent some time talking with James Chen about the persecuted church. And so take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to listen to either or both of those interviews again, you can click on the button that says Listen. Or if you want to watch it, of course, we have that there, but even easier, you can go to the YouTube channel that we have there and watch the broadcasts once again. So I hope you've appreciated the conversation we've had here on Point of View, and I really want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.